Welcome to Politics in the Pub, and as most of you know, my name is Joe Nagy, and I will be chairing this evening's meeting, which is what can we expect from the new Australian government, how will it affect social justice and equity, and what is to be done. On behalf of all of us here, I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we are gathered, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their leaders past and present. We are indeed truly privileged to have two expert speakers on the subject, Professor Frank Stilwell and Dr. Jim Stanford from the Australia Institute Centre for Future Work. We all know about Frank Stilwell, so I don't have to say too much about him, except that he'll keep us entertained and informed, as he always does. Now, I think I've lost him now. Anyway, Jim Stanford. He is an economist and a director of the Centre for Future Work based at the Australia Institute. The Australia Institute is Australia's most influential progressive think tank. The Centre for Future Work is a new institute initiative focusing on issues of work, labour markets, income, economic development, skills, and more. The Centre was founded in May 2016, and Jim is its inaugural director. Jim recently was relocated to Sydney, Australia from Toronto, where he was one of Canada's best-known economic commentators. He served for over 20 years as an economist and director of policy under Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, which was formerly known as the Canadian Auto Workers. He still advises the union and is also the Harold Innis Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University in Hamilton, which happens to be my hometown, or was my hometown, in Canada. Fractional appointment. You'll have to explain that sometime. I can't sure what you meant by fractional appointment, but never mind.
There's a numerator and a denominator.
That makes sense. He is also the honorary professor of political economy at the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Jim received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. He also holds a Master of Philosophy from Cambridge University and a BA in Honours from the University of Calgary, Alberta. Jim is the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism. It's a second edition published by the Pluto Books in 2015, which has been published in 6 languages. Stanford has written, edited, or co-edited 5 other books and dozens of articles and reports in both peer-reviewed and popular outlets. Jim maintains an active presence on social media through his Twitter and Facebook accounts. Jim has designed and taught numerous courses on economics for academic and non-academic audiences, including a unique week-long popular education course in economics for trade union members, which he has delivered in Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. He is recognized for his ability to communicate economic concepts in an accessible, humorous manner. Frank will open the batting. Thank you, Frank.
Well, thanks for the invitation to speak again at Politics in the Pub. I think this is a rather interesting topic. What can we expect from the new Australian government led by Malcolm Turnbull?
I hate to think.
He's very angry today.
Yes. Probably more turn and more bull, I expect.
Oh dear. We're in for a good
This
one.
could be the shortest ever speech at Politics in the Pub. We now know the electoral outcome, although it did take a prodigious long time before it became clear, and it is indeed an outcome that is highly problematic for the incumbent government. A majority of one clear seat in the lower house, and a Senate in which they've got 30 seats. Labor have got 26. The Greens have got 9. The Hansonites have got 4. Nick Xenophon team 3. And then there's 4 other assorted independents. Jackie Lambie, Darren Hinch, Bob Day, and what's that other fellow's name? Lion. I always get his name wrong. Yeah, the shooter. Yeah, Lionhelm. It's going to be very difficult, I think, to pass any coherent legislation through both of these Houses of Parliament. So the first answer, the first scenario that I want to paint is one in which nothing much happens.
Well, that can work for 3 years.
Yeah. In fact, during the long period before we knew the election outcome, and there was some possibilities of hung parliaments and great uncertainty, a young colleague of mine at Sydney University said, well, look, this is a disaster, isn't it? You know, we're not going to have a functioning government. Now, I said to him, look, I don't know that it's a disaster. I mean, governments are engaged in legislative change, but the country will run regardless of whether or not we've got a functioning government with a majority capable of passing legislation. The public service runs the country in the broad sense. I mean, some would say the capitalists run the economy. The political class is not actually central to the day-to-day functioning of our society and economy. Things will go on perfectly well without any capacity for legislative change. Of course, you won't get tax reform, you won't get legislation to allow marriage equality, you wouldn't get changes to other areas of policy, although governments can indeed make certain regulatory changes that don't require legislation to go through both Houses of Parliament. Governments can declare war without any such processes. They can appoint royal commissions, as we know. Malcolm Turnbull did that as a sort of reflex response to a particular news item about what was going on in a Northern Territory detention centre for young people. So all of these things can continue to happen, even if the government is completely stymied in its capacity to pass legislation. So I think probably that's the first scenario that we need to carefully consider and indeed anticipate. In other words, lots of parliamentary shenanigans, you know, as governments are wooing minority party senators and so on in the hope of getting them to support particular bills, but very little coming out at the other end. So a lot of energy, a lot of activity, and not much output. Not a very efficient system, you might say, for organising any institution, but nonetheless a quite likely scenario in the period ahead. A second possibility, though, a second scenario deserves, I think, careful consideration, and that is that we've got a government with a slim majority, but one that will be, in effect, hostage to the right-wing forces within the Liberal National parties. In other words, though we've got a bit of a show pony, indeed, in certain respects, a quite likeable Prime Minister. He's intelligent, articulate. Well, look, after Tony Abbott, anyone would have looked good. I knew both of these guys when they were students at Sydney University, and it confirms my view that very few of us fundamentally change through our lives. I mean, we tend to become caricatures of what we were like as young people. Our good features and our grotesque features become increasingly exaggerated over time. And this is true for both Turnbull and Abbott. Abbott was a thug as a student politician, and, you know, though he developed a few sort of people skills, oh God, I mean, it's still the same basically nasty, bullying individual he always was. Turnbull was always intelligent, saw himself as a rather clever young man from an early age. I was involved in the political economy dispute at the University of Sydney. Within the economics department, the left wing and the right wing were at loggerheads. The students were revolting, and Turnbull comes along to my office one day and he says, I want to fix this. He wasn't even studying in the department. He was an elected student representative on the academic board, but he said, look, this dispute is bringing the university into ill repute. Articles appear on the Sydney Morning Herald, students are getting arrested, and it seems that the university management can't resolve this internal conflict. I think I can. And so he tried to do a Henry Kissinger sort of shuttle diplomacy act between me and some of the other people on the political left, and those in the department, particularly the senior professors who were right-wingers, people who'd helped develop the Centre for Independent Studies, among other things, pretty blatantly conservative economists. And frankly, I thought it was a silly endeavour of Malcolm's at the time, although to give him credit, he wanted to actually produce some compromise that would chart a way forward. And though at the time nothing much came of it, I could see that it was well-intentioned, well thought out, but just lacking judgment about the institutional possibilities and the power plays that were involved. So you can see echoes of all of this stuff in what they're doing later in life on the bigger federal stage. But Malcolm has already shown that he's not actually willing to stand up to the right-wing forces within his own party. It's already quite clear that that's the case. He's backed down on all the things that historically he said he was committed to, and he's embracing an agenda that's not fundamentally different from Tony Abbott's. So what are we going to get? An economic plan that was touted during the federal election, which actually comes down to no more than three elements, in my mind. One is an innovation policy, which actually is a ragtag of bits and pieces held together with some rhetoric about the need for grasping the opportunities opened up by modern technology. There's not much in it. It was well received by the business community when he announced it as his first signature policy shortly after he wrested the leadership out of Tony Abbott's hands. But it's small change stuff, and frankly it looks overshadowed by what's actually being done in respect of technology issues. Defunding the CSIRO, Australia's premier scientific institution, giving us a second-rate national broadband network, one that's well below what is technologically possible and would put the country in a more economically advantageous position for the future. So the rhetoric doesn't quite match what's actually being done in respect of creating opportunities and indeed the infrastructure for modern technology to gain in momentum. Second element in the policy is submarines. Well, it is supposed to be saving jobs in South Australia, and I don't just mean Christopher Pyne's job, although that's the most obvious concern, presumably, of this policy, is to maintain political base for the coalition in South Australia, where there is substantial economic difficulties. The closure of the car industry, growing unemployment, that submarines project was really crucial. Now, frankly, I'm not a defence expert, so I don't know whether actually we need any submarines in Australia, who's the enemy, and whether this is the appropriate instruments of war that we need to arm ourselves with. And no doubt the military leaders want more toys to play with, but these are very, very expensive toys. The official bill is somewhere in the range of $50 to $60 billion, and I'm told from what I've been reading that the likely cost is about 3 times that amount once you take account of maintenance and servicing costs of these items of equipment over their working lives. So this is a massive expenditure commitment, and it is, in a way, an economic policy, because it will create some jobs locally and may have some secondary or multiplier effects on maintaining levels of income, expenditure and output in related industries, particularly in South Australia. But the third element, and the element that the government has touted most vigorously, is of course the cut to business taxation. This is the main element. Some would say it's the only element in Turnbull's so-called economic plan. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of this. If fully implemented over 10 years, it would cost the government around $50 billion in terms of revenue foregone. Much of that, particularly in the later parts of that period, would go to big business. Much of it would go in benefits to foreign shareholders. The extent to which it would actually create any stimulatory effects for business activity in Australia is highly uncertain. Very schematically, I think you can say there's 4 ifs. One, uncertainty about whether cutting business taxes actually leads to increased business investment. Not sure that it would. Every first-year economics student learns that the main influence on whether businesses are inclined to invest is whether they anticipate a growth in the demand for their products. Just giving them a bit more money in their back pocket after they paid their last year's tax bill doesn't necessarily mean that that will flow through into expanding their businesses through installing new technology, new equipment, building new premises and so forth. They're only likely to do that if they expect a growth in the demand for their products. And that actually might be driven more by rising wages than cutting taxes, so that there are people out there who are actually spending. So that's a big uncertainty. But even if there were some increase in investment, would it be job generating? Much investment these days is capital displacing. And indeed, Turnbull himself, in talking about an innovation agenda with new technologies, is talking about forms of investment that are typically capital rather than labour intensive. So it's by no means clear that jobs would flow on from this process. And even if they did, would they be jobs that would be sustainable for the future? An across-the-board tax cut applies equally to coal miners, to producers of solar energy, rooftop panels, and so forth. In other words, it's not targeted to industries that have good future prospects and are both economically and ecologically sustainable. And finally, there's much better things that could be done with that money. If there's $50 billion that can be played with in order to create economic stimulus, why not build infrastructure? We need better transport systems, we need better schools, education facilities generally, hospitals. The construction of infrastructure of that kind is directly job creating and has strong multiplier effects within local economies. So it seems to me that this is a flawed model to create increased economic activity. What it certainly will do, though, if implemented, is increase economic inequality. In other words, it will shift the balance between incomes to labour and capital. And it'll do so in a way that will further intensify the economic inequalities that exist in Australian society. And that being the case, I confidently predict there would actually be increased demand for expenditures to deal with the problems that result from social inequality. More expenditures on health will be needed because there are clear correlations, according to social science evidence, between economic inequality and the intensity of health problems, both physical and mental. The countries with the highest inequality tend to have the highest incidence of those problems, and thus the greatest demands on governments for expenditure in those areas. Similar arguments, not surprisingly, apply to crimes and prison incarceration. Where there's inequality, rates of crime tend to be higher than in societies where there's more equality and more social cohesion. Again, costs of running prison systems, very expensive on the public purse. So these are, it seems to me, hazards that result from these policies and ensure, to my mind, that word isn't too strong, ensure that they will not result in the budget repair that the government claims they will. Their hope is that, or if you can judge from the rhetoric, whether they really believe it, I don't know, but the rhetoric says if we can cut business taxes, we'll get more investment, we'll get more jobs, we'll get more incomes, that will generate more tax revenues for government, and that will help us to repair the budget deficit and eventually return to running balanced budgets or surplus budgets. Well, many a slip twixt cup and lip. I think this is a most unlikely scenario. What we will have is a more increasingly unequal society and all the social costs and social problems that brings. Much in my mind at the moment, because in conjunction with Chris Shield from the Everett Foundation, we've just put out a little booklet on what's happening with inequality in Australia right now. This is a little booklet which you could pick up free at the break. So I just this afternoon ran off about 40 photocopies. That's not a bad prediction, actually. Who said economists are rotten forecasters? This one's reasonably spot on. It shows, in Australia at the moment, if you're looking at wealth, that is what's people accumulated assets, you know, how much money they've got, how much housing, land, other property, shares, and so forth that they own. Approximately, let me get this right, the top 10% of Australian households own more than half of all assets. The top 10% own more than half of that national wealth. Actually, within that top 10%, the top 1% are really advantaged in that they have approximately 15% of the national wealth. At the other extreme, there's 40% who effectively have no wealth. And of those, half are actually have negative wealth in that their debts exceed what small assets they may have. So this is a society that, notwithstanding claims about Australian egalitarianism, is not egalitarian in practice. Look, I enjoy egalitarian rhetoric as much as the next person. But the reality of what's going on out there is indeed very different, and we can't afford, I think, either economically or socially, to let those inequalities become yet more polarised. So that, I think, is the big danger if the economic plan of the government is implemented. And I haven't even mentioned cuts to welfare and other social policies. Remember the Joe Hockey budget of 2014, of course, was targeted at those cuts. And indeed, some are flowing through as a consequence of changes brought about by budgets in the previous coalition government. It seems to me, though, that this is would only exacerbate the scenario that I've just described. And indeed, I might say as an aside, it does make possible the resurgence of a hike in the GST. Because if a government's really serious about budget repair, and if, as seems highly likely, the business tax cut makes the situation worse, not better. And if they're stymied in doing further cuts to social policy programs because they're fearful of a public backlash like the one that occurred following the 2014 budget of Joe Hockey, they're left with almost no other option but to raise the GST, which of course we know Malcolm Turnbull and his treasurer Scott Morrison were toying with during the so-called tax conversation in the first 4 or 5 months of this year. So that's scenario one, not much happening. Scenario two, some nasty things coming down the track. You wouldn't be surprised to hear me say, well, then that ushers in the need, if not the likelihood, certainly the need for scenario three. Scenario three is that this provides an opportunity for the left, for progressive forces to come up with and start mobilising around an alternative plan for economic and social reform. One that emphasises job creation in sectors that are indeed economically and ecologically sustainable. One that sets up a process for tax reform that is aimed at producing more equitable outcomes, putting things on the table such as Labour has already done, as in terminating negative gearing, tightening up on superannuation concessions for the wealthy, but also further use of land taxation, which gets at much of that accumulated wealth, and possibly even inheritance taxation, which we used to have in Australia and are conspicuous on the international stage by not having, and thus, of course, the inequalities that I referred to earlier tend to be perpetuated and indeed accentuated intergenerationally. But there are many other areas where economic and social policy reform could and should be developed. Health, education, obviously, but cities too. Some of you would have seen the little leaflet I was handing out before the start of tonight's session, put together by a man named Ian Spring, who's occasionally attended politics in the pub, and he really is making strong arguments for building better infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, which he says can be done through borrowing at very low interest rates. And indeed, given the situation of remarkably low interest rates right now, this does indeed provide an opportunity for infrastructure repair and improvement at very little public cost. So there's no shortage of opportunities for mobilisation around an alternative programme that would prepare us better for the demise of the Turnbull government. It will happen. Some Labour people are predicting it'll happen within a year, but it will happen within 3 years, to be sure. And I think people with more progressive inclinations need to take this opportunity to get ready. Now, that actually means doing things that some people find very uncomfortable. Greens talking to Labour, for example. Getting trade unions involved in these dialogues rather than demonising them as if they're some kind of union bosses that are working against the public interest. Getting environmental organisations, educational groups, social welfare organisations involved in dialogue so that we have a popular movement and what you might call a civic ownership of an alternative programme, because it seems to me that we're really going to need it.
Thank you.